So I wanted to talk a little bit in this video about Darwin himself and about how he came about discovering his theory of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin was, a aristocratic British guy in the 19th century who was like a lot of people. When he was young, went to college, didn't really know what he wanted to do. At first studied medicine, was not particularly successful or interested in that. Then he studied theology at Cambridge, thought he might want to be a priest. And upon graduating, realized that wasn't for him, didn't know quite what he wanted to do. But one of his professors that he really liked was a professor of biology, essentially. He was a naturalist, and got him this position aboard a boat with Captain Robert Fitzroy called the Beagle for this 5-year round-the-world voyage so that he could catalog species in all sorts of different places around the world, and also because Captain Robert Fitzroy wanted some educated company while he was on this long, long voyage. Now, during this voyage, he went to a lot of different places. Specifically in South America, we talk a lot about the Galapagos Islands, but he was on mainland South America as well. And he looked at a lot of living and dead species, did a lot of collecting, but he noticed a lot of these uplifts. And as we talked about in the last video, these strata that you find when you look at the geology of an area, when you have a lot of erosion like in the Grand Canyon or an uplift. And he noticed that in the upper layers, you found species of animals that looked a lot like the living species. But as you got lower and lower, there was less and less resemblance. Darwin may not have been thinking along these lines if it weren't for the fact that he had a copy of Lyell's Principles of Geology that he was reading along the way. And this was putting forward this idea of uniformitarianism that we talked about in the last video, and also this idea that the Earth was more than 6,000 years old. He proposed many millions of years. We now know that the Earth is over 4.5 billion years old, which allows a lot more time for the kind of change that Darwin eventually theorized. He also looked at the geographic distribution of species, and he noticed that, for instance, in the Galapagos Islands, there were a lot of species that looked a bit like the species that you saw on the mainland of South America, but that were a little bit different, and that were even a little bit different from one another on different islands. So, for instance, we'll talk about the finches in a bit, but Galapagos tortoises are these giant, really cool-looking tortoises. And the Galapagos Islands are not particularly beautiful, so I've been told. I've not had the pleasure of going there. But they were originally a place where sailors would stop by, because they're in the middle of the ocean, and they could get fresh water, and they could load up on food. And one of the ways they would get food, they would take these giant tortoises, they would bring them on the boat, because they were pretty easy to handle, and they would keep them alive, because that way they wouldn't spoil, and they would have fresh meat for when they were in the middle of nowhere on their voyage again. And Darwin, talking to these sailors, realized that the sailors knew, based on the look of the snout and the shell, exactly which island from the Galapagos these tortoises came from. And Darwin noted that there was specificity on each of these islands, and so he hypothesized that maybe species from the mainland of South America could have colonized these Galapagos Islands, and different islands one by one, and eventually could have maybe diverged from one another. This is a look at where Darwin went. Now, he went all around the world, not just to South America, not just to the Galapagos, although did spend a lot of time down here, and that's sort of famously what we think of in terms of Darwin's voyage. But while he was there, he noted that these species seemed to be adapted to their environment, and he focused a lot on this perceived adaptation. And he looked at this not only while he was on the trip, but he took a lot of these samples home, these collections that he made, and he thought about them for years and years after the voyage. And that was when he really was developing this idea of evolution by natural selection. Darwin would sit in his home and read his notes and look at his specimens, and he noted that, for instance, species that lived on different islands or that tended to have different diets on these different islands had, even though they had lots of other similarities, these are all finches, right? They had different sized beaks. The cactus eater, right, had this beak that could get into the flowers. Right, the insect had this skinny little beak that could get inside the trees and needle out the insects. The seed eaters had these really thick beaks that could crunch these dry seeds. They all seemed to be fit to whatever their diet was, whatever their habitat was. So years after the voyage, he wrote all this up in an essay on natural selection as the mechanism for evolution, or as he called it initially, descent with modification, right? But he knew that it was going to be controversial. He was afraid, and so he did not introduce his theory publicly. He told friends about it. He told some other scientists about it, and word got around in that community. But in 1858, 14 years later, he received a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace, who had heard that Darwin was working on these things, was another biologist, and he had developed a theory of natural selection that was almost identical to Darwin's. And he wanted Darwin to look it over because, again, he had heard through the grapevine that Darwin was working on things like this. And Darwin realized at that point it was going to happen anyway, and he didn't want to lose credit. So he brought in Alfred Russel Wallace, said, I'm working on the same thing. They published papers together, literally at the same time, so they could share credit. And Darwin then really worked hard to finish up his book. In the next year, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which hashed this all out in a lot more detail, presented a lot more evidence, and because of that, Darwin ended up sort of historically getting all the credit. But I'm personally a big Alfred Russel Wallace fan. Don't want him to get forgotten in the mix. This idea of evolution by natural selection explained so much. It explained the unity of life, why there are so many things that are common amongst all living things, right? Why? Because we all shared a common ancestor, right? Why do we all have cells? We're all made of cells. So those cells have phospholipid bilayers. We have one language of inheritance, DNA and RNA. We have ribosomes, which create proteins out of those things. But life is diverse, and this also explains the diversity, because as many environments and habitats and niches within those habitats as there are going to be species to match up with all of those, right? Because they will evolve to become more fit for that specific environment. And so that unity of life, that diversity of life, and that match between organisms and their environment, it's all explained by evolution by natural selection. It's like there was a scientist called Theodosius Dobzhansky who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I'm paraphrasing that a little bit. But if you go to the eye doctor and they kept switching the lens and they're like, which looks clearer? Number one, number two, right? Number one, number two. And sometimes they switch it and all of a sudden, boom, all the letters are clear. This is what biology looked like when evolution by natural selection became widely known and discussed. Now, Darwin's name is associated with evolution, as it should be, but he actually didn't use the word evolution in the first edition of Origin of the Species one time. He used the phrase descent with modification, right? This idea that we go from one generation to the next with slight modifications. And he put forward the idea that we were all descended from one family tree. So the base common ancestor is the trunk, and then we branch off just like your family tree would. And he wrote this out in his notes, and I love it because it shows you this idea of a tree. It's just a little sketch, and also because it has this up top, I think. And that is the essence of science, right? This idea that this brilliant thought that I just came up with, this hypothesis. Well, I don't know, right? I think and we need to find evidence to see whether it is the case or not. And I have a kid at home who's now 2.5, but when she was a baby, the biology department bought her a little onesie that had that on there, and it was the best gift that we could have gotten. This is an example of the end of one of those branches on the evolutionary tree. And all these little twigs out here are species. And some of them are still alive, like our African and Asian elephants. Some of them are extinct, like mammoths, for instance, and stegodons. But you can see manatees are actually fairly closely related to elephants in the grand scheme of things. One of the ways that Darwin came about his thinking of a natural selection being the mechanism for evolution was what he called artificial selection. Right? He noted that we have been modifying other species by selectively breeding them for a long time. For instance, wild mustard, a brassica species, has been artificially selected to become kale if we select it for large leaves. If we select it for axillary buds, Brussels sprouts. If we select it for the apical bud, it becomes cabbage. If it is selected for the flowers, it becomes broccoli. If it's selected for the stems, you get kohlrabi. All of these vegetables come from the exact same ancestor, and not an ancestor 50 million years ago, right? An ancestor that is in recorded history, right? This is written down. We know that we did this. And Darwin thought, well, if we can select for desired characteristics, and in a relatively small number of generations, we can get such wildly different results, why can't nature select for desired characteristics? And those desired characteristics, we don't need to personify nature, right? Nature doesn't have specific things at once just for the heck of it. But if you're in an environment that's dry, then nature is going to be selecting for organisms that are able to better more efficiently utilize water, for instance. In addition to domesticated plants like crops, Darwin also found artificial selection to be a factor in the breeding of pigeons. So back in his day in England, for whatever reason, the breeding of outlandish pigeons like these guys was all the rage. And he knew, again, this is recorded history, these all came from the rock pigeon, which is what you would see in downtown Cincinnati, right? Pooping on statues. But if it's selected for specific characteristics, you can get just in a short number of years, short number of generations, these wildly different looking pigeons. And you may be more familiar with dogs, which Darwin also was familiar with. Right? They all descended from the wild wolf, right? And they're all still one species. These aren't even separate species yet. But we have breeds of dog that are only 50 years old, right? Not that old at all. And you may want them to be small, and you may get a poodle or whatever the heck these things are. You may want them to be big, and you get, a Doberman. You may want them to have large heads, and you get a bulldog. You may want them to have excellent sniffers, and you get a bloodhound. But whatever it is, we can artificially choose the characteristics that we want, breed organisms that have those characteristics, and then we end up with exaggerated versions of those characteristics over generations. Similarly, in the wild, the environment can provide a situation in which certain characteristics are much more beneficial for organisms in a population. And organisms, just because of natural diversity, that happen to have traits that make them better able to survive in that environment are going to survive better. If those traits are heritable, their offspring are going to collect genes for those traits. And over many, many generations, you're going to get a change in the gene makeup of the population. And that is evolution. Next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about this same subject.